All right, strap in, everyone, because today we're diving headfirst into, well, voting rights.
Voting rights, yeah.
But not just any old voting rights case. We're talking about a situation where someone was told, you can't vote for this Senate nominee unless, get this, you pay a $45 fee to a political party.
Seriously, a $45 fee just to vote.
I know, wild right. Sounds more like a cover charge at a club than
Just gonna say.
access to democracy.
Exactly. That's exactly what this case, Morse v. Republican Party of Virginia, gets at.
Morse v. Republican Party of Virginia.
Yeah, and we're going deep into the weeds here, folks.
Oh, yeah.
We got the actual Supreme Court oral arguments, the back and forth, the whole shebang.
The transcript, the whole 9 yards.
We'll unpack it all. Make sense of the legal jargon, don't worry.
No law degree required.
Absolutely not.
So to set the stage, imagine this. It's 1995.
Right.
You're in Virginia. You're a Republican.
Right.
And you want to, do your civic duty, help choose who your party nominates for the U.S. Senate.
Sounds pretty standard.
Right. Normal political process, right?
You'd think so. Should be.
Should be. But here's where things take a turn.
Okay, I'm intrigued.
Virginia Republicans at that time, they didn't use a primary to pick their Senate candidate.
Interesting.
They used a convention system.
Okay.
And to even get into that convention hall, the place where the deciding vote happened,
Yeah.
you had to pay up.
Had to pay literally
$45 just to walk in the door.
So it's like, welcome to democracy. Here's your entry fee.
Basically. And you can already see
Yeah.
this is going to cause some problems.
Oh, yeah. Huge problems, because now we're talking about more than just voting. It's about whether your right to vote.
It's tied to your wallet.
Exactly. It's tied to your wallet. And that's where the Voting Rights Act comes in.
Right. That big piece of legislation meant to protect voters, especially from these kinds of barriers, these discriminatory practices that can keep people from having their say.
Exactly. A cornerstone of a functioning democracy.
But, and here's where it gets interesting, the Voting Rights Act, it mostly focuses on states and political subdivisions.
Right. States, the government.
Not political parties directly.
And that's the loophole this case is poking at.
It is.
Like, imagine the law is laser focused on states, right?
Right.
But what happens when a political party basically controls who even gets on the ballot in the state?
By charging a fee.
Potentially by charging a fee, among other things. It's a loophole you could drive a truck through.
You could, and that's what these lawyers are battling over in front of the Supreme Court, right?
Exactly.
Is a political party, in this very specific instance, acting like an arm of the state.
Right, like, are they more than just a club, more than just a group you join? Are they closer to a government entity?
Like, are they performing a government function, is essentially what it comes down to.
Exactly. And to make their case, the folks challenging this fee, they bring up a really interesting historical comparison.
Okay, hit me with it.
The white primaries.
Ah, from back in the Jim Crow era.
Exactly, way back when.
And just as a reminder for our listeners, these were, well, they were run by parties.
Run by parties, yeah.
But they were essentially the only way to get on the ballot in a lot of places.
The only game in town.
So even though it was a party thing, the court said, nope, this is a state function in disguise.
Unconstitutional, the whole thing.
Because it was the only game in town.
It's like a restaurant, right?
Okay.
With that sign, no shirt, no shoes, no service.
Right, right.
Private business. But they're enforcing rules we expect from, well, everywhere.
Public spaces, common areas.
Yeah, public spaces.
Okay, I get the analogy.
Right.
But don't parties have a right to, well, be parties?
It's a good point.
Like, to make their own rules,
Yeah.
decide who's in, who's out. If we start saying the government can come in and dictate every little thing they do,
Yeah.
isn't that, I don't know, infringing on freedom of association?
It's a classic dilemma. How do you balance the right to freely associate, support the candidates you choose
Right.
with the need to make sure everyone has a fair shot at the ballot box?
Equal access.
Equal access, exactly.
And the court, they've always been really careful about, stepping on the toes of how parties run their internal affairs, right?
Very hesitant to interfere
Yeah.
unless absolutely necessary.
But where is that line? Like, if a party can control who ends up on the ballot, what's to stop them from saying only people who agree with us 100% can get through?
Right.
That's not very democratic, is it?
Not exactly the picture of a healthy democracy, no. That's the question, isn't it? Like, where does a party's right to do its own thing bump up against something as fundamental as the right to vote?
Right, because we do what we want. That's not exactly how a democracy should work.
Exactly. And to hammer that point home, the lawyers fighting this fee, they really got into the nitty-gritty of how the whole system in Virginia was set up.
Okay, so less about the $45 itself and more about what that represents.
Totally. They're saying this isn't just a random fee, it's a symptom of a system that might be rigged in favor of those already in power.
Interesting. So by putting up this barrier, even if it seems small, it could have ripple effects on who gets to have a voice in the political process.
Exactly. And it gets even juicier because they bring up how the Voting Rights Act itself defines voting.
Okay, so we're going deep on legal definitions now. Always fun.
Right, because you'd think voting, that's pretty simple, right? You show up on election day, cast your ballot, boom, done.
Yeah, seems straightforward enough.
But the Voting Rights Act, it takes a much broader view.
Really? Like how much broader are we talking?
Well, the lawyers were arguing that voting, according to the Act, includes any action that affects whether your vote even counts.
So it's not just about the act of voting itself, but all the stuff that happens before that even determines who ends up on the ballot.
You got it. Think of it like a domino effect.
Okay, I'm listening.
Choosing party officials, like the delegates at these conventions who pick the Senate nominee, that has a huge impact, right?
Right. So that $45 fee to even get into that convention hall.
Suddenly not so small anymore.
Not so small. It's like you're not just paying to get in the door, you're paying to have a say in who represents you in the Senate.
Exactly. And this is where we really start to dig into the weeds of legal interpretation.
Oh boy, always my favorite.
Because now we're talking about figuring out what Congress intended back in 1965 when they wrote this law.
Did they ever imagine it would stretch this far? Into a party's own nominating process? Tough to say.
Right. It's like we're playing legal archaeologists here, brushing off the dust to see what they really meant.
And you can't forget the political landscape back then, especially in the South. It was a whole different ballgame.
Oh, absolutely. The lawyers challenging this fee, they brought that up big time.
Because if the law only applied to states and not to parties, wouldn't that have been a huge loophole back then?
100%. And they hammered that point home.
I mean, think about it. 1965, the South was basically a one-party system, right? The Democrats were in charge.
Right. So if you could just shift all the discriminatory tactics from, say, state-run elections to the party level, what's the point of the Voting Rights Act?
It would totally defeat the purpose.
Exactly. And that was their argument. If you want to understand this law, you have to look at the historical context, the problems it was meant to solve.
It's like trying to understand a joke without knowing anything about the culture it came from.
Exactly. You're missing half the story.
But then you have the other side, saying, hold on, the law is pretty clear. It mentions states, not political parties.
Right. And the lawyers defending the fee, they were all over that.
If Congress wanted it to include parties, they would have said so.
Right. That was their argument. Plain and simple. No need to overcomplicate things.
And they had a point about potential overreach, right? Like, if every single rule a party has, from picking their nominees to where they hold their meetings, has to go through the Voting Rights Act lens.
Suddenly the government is calling all the shots.
Yeah, and that does seem like it could get out of hand pretty quickly.
Exactly. And they use the freedom of association argument here, saying forcing parties to jump through all these hoops, it would be a huge burden and might even violate their First Amendment rights.
So which is it? Freedom of association or a level playing field for voters? How did the court even begin to balance those two?
Right, because you can't just have one without the other. And the lawyers defending the fee in this case, they brought up how the Voting Rights Act had actually been used in the past.
Like, what kind of track record did it have?
Exactly. They pointed out that the Justice Department had usually focused on stuff related to, like, the mechanics of elections.
Okay, so the actual process, the nuts and bolts.
Right, like those old literacy tests, poll taxes, things like that.
Or how voting districts are drawn, that kind of thing.
Exactly, the nitty-gritty stuff, not so much a deep dive into how a party chooses its candidates.
So they're saying there's a precedent here. The Voting Rights Act hasn't typically gone this far.
Exactly, and that suggests a more limited scope for the law.
But doesn't that seem, I don't know, a little arbitrary? I mean, we're talking about charging people money to be a part of the process of choosing a Senate nominee.
Right.
That has a real impact on whether your vote matters, even if it's happening before Election Day.
And that's exactly what makes this case so fascinating. It highlights how tricky it can be to interpret these laws, especially as the world changes around them.
Because what seemed crystal clear back in 1965 might look totally different decades later.
Totally different context, and the rules of the game have shifted.
Especially with something as important as voting rights, even small tweaks can have huge consequences.
Huge consequences, absolutely. And it all goes back to that fundamental question of power. Who has it, who doesn't, and how do we make sure everyone's voice is heard?
Right, because if a system is set up in a way that benefits the few at the expense of the many,
Well, that's not really democracy, is it?
Not even close. So after all that back and forth, where did the court land? What happened?
The million-dollar question, right?
Always is, and we're not going to spoil the ending for you. You'll have to do a little digging yourself to see how this all played out.
Do some research, see what you think.
But I can tell you this, their decision, it had a major impact on how we understand the relationship between the Voting Rights Act and political parties.
No doubt about it. It's a decision that's still being debated and analyzed today by legal scholars, by voting rights advocates, by folks like us.
Exactly. And that's what we want to leave you with today, that idea that these questions, they matter. And this case, it really makes you think.
It does.
At what point does a private organization become so intertwined with the government that it's basically acting on its behalf?
Right. Where do we draw that line?
And when those lines get blurry, how do we protect something as fundamental, as essential as the right to vote?
It's a question worth pondering, that's for sure.
It is, and it's something to keep in mind the next time you engage in any part of the political process, whether it's primaries, conventions, those all-important general elections. Because ultimately having your voice heard, making sure our democracy reflects the will of the people, that's something worth fighting for.
100%. It's the foundation of a functioning society.
Absolutely. And on that note, we'll leave you to ponder that. Until next time, keep asking those tough questions and keep diving deep.